Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Now today I wanted to tackle or attempt to tackle a very controversial subject, and that is the death of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Wales, in December 1282. As I've hinted at in previous videos, the exact circumstances of Llywelyn's death are still unclear. Even though some serious attempts have been made to sort through all the documentary evidence for it. And there's quite a lot. There's something like between 30 to 40 different chronicle sources, English and Welsh, as well as various batches of correspondence and other records. But it is quite difficult, even with all this information, to sift through it all and attempt to piece together exactly what were the circumstances of Llywelyn's death. It still remains quite an emotional subject for many people, as I've found in the past when I've attempted to engage with them. I can't cover everything in a single video, but I just wanted to highlight something I personally find very interesting. I'm using two sources, one of which is this. I don't know if you can see that. Letters of a Peacemaker by a chap named Anthony Edwards. Edwards was an interesting character. He published this material in a series of pamphlets in the 1980s. He wasn't a trained historian as such, he was very much an enthusiast, but he does deserve credit for making the effort to put together all the relevant correspondence and translate it into English from the Latin and the French and present it in his work. I don't personally agree with many of his arguments or conclusions. I think he was very prejudiced in his mindset, and came up with some very unsustainable conclusions. But I don't want to be too harsh on him, the late Anthony Edwards, to be disrespectful towards his memory. He did make a serious effort to put this material together and present it to the public, so he deserves credit for that. The other source I'm using is more recent, and this is The Killing of Prince Llywelyn of Wales by Paul Martin Remfry, who I know personally. This is a very impressive book. Paul has, even more so than Anthony Edwards, he's collected all of the relevant source material, all of the contemporary and near contemporary sources, chronicles, letters, etc. And he's put them into context, into order, everything translated and put in its correct context, so you can get as clear and as accurate an impression as you could wish for, given the nature of the evidence. I mean, bear in mind this material is over 700 years old. So what I wanted to focus on in this video, and maybe another, depending on how we do for time, is a batch of letters that were written by John Peckham, Archbishop of Canterbury, in mid-December 1282, very soon after Llywelyn's death on the 11th of December, possibly within 24 hours of it, as soon as Peckham received word of what had happened. Peckham was based in Herefordshire. He was at a place called Stretton Sugwas, and then he moved to Pembridge. And this is very close to the Welsh border, and quite close to where Llywelyn met his death, near Bwlch in mid-Wales on the middle March. So very shortly after Llywelyn is killed, Edmund Mortimer, who is the Lord of Wigmore in the Welsh March, and is named by most sources as being chiefly responsible for killing Llywelyn. He comes to meet John Peckham at Pembridge in Herefordshire, which is a Mortimer manor, and he tells Peckham what has happened. And Peckham then very conveniently writes a series of letters One of them is addressed to the King, Edward I, and the other to Robert Burnell, who is the Lord Chancellor of England and Bishop of Bath and Wells. So bear in mind the nature of these letters and this correspondence. This is not public correspondence. It's not meant for anyone's eyes except these three very high-powered individuals, the most powerful men in the kingdom, really, the King, the Archbishop and the Chancellor, and the clerks who actually write the letters. So it's the medieval equivalent of top-level, very high-security correspondence, and nobody else except these three men would have had access to the contents. So the account of events that Peckham gives has got to be about as close to the reality as we're going to get, unless some other amazing piece of evidence is discovered at some point, because Peckham has no vested interest in trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the King or his colleague, the Chancellor. Both of them want to know exactly what has happened. How has Llywelyn died? Because this is a very important event, and it's Peckham's job, it's his duty to tell them. Whatever he might say in public, this personal and private correspondence to the King and the Chancellor has got to be about as accurate as Peckham can make it. And he's getting his information, of course, direct from Edmund Mortimer, who was actually there at the death and probably organised it. So there are two versions of this, of these letters. As I said, the first one is addressed to Edward, and I'll read out the relevant part. So, to the Lord King, to his very dear Lord Edward, by grace of God, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Aquitaine, Brother John, by the sufferance of God, Archbishop of Canterbury, Primate of all England, greetings in great reverence. Sire, know that those who were at the death of Llywelyn found in the most secret part of his body some small things which we have seen. Among the other things there was a treasonable letter disguised by false names, and that you may be warned, we send a copy of the letter to the Bishop of Bath, and the same letter is held by Edmund Mortimer, and the privy seal of Llywelyn, and these things you may have at your pleasure. And this we send to warn you, and not that anyone should be troubled for it. And we implore you that no one may suffer death or mutilation in consequence of our information, and that what we send you may be secret. Besides this, sire, know that the Lady Matilda Longspay begged us through letters to absolve Llywelyn, that he might be buried in consecrated ground, and we sent word to her that we would do nothing if it could not be proved that he showed signs of true repentance before his death. And Edmund Mortimer said to me that he had heard from his valets who were at the death, that he asked for the priest before his death, but without sure certainty we will do nothing. Besides this, know that the same day he was killed, a white monk, Cistercian, sang mass to him, and my Lord Roger Mortimer has the vestments. And then Peckham goes on to ask the King to show mercy to certain clerks who are in Snowdonia. But the relevant section related to Llywelyn is interesting, to say the least. What Peckham has described is that those who were at the death of Llywelyn, they searched the prince's body after he'd been killed, and they found some very interesting items on it, including a treasonable letter disguised by false names, a coded letter, in other words, that was found in the most secret part of his body. So Llywelyn had taken care to hide this letter on his person. And apart from the letter, they also found his privy seal and various other things which Peckham obviously doesn't think were important enough to describe. And then there's this strange sort of warning note. Peckham is saying to the King that nobody should be troubled over this matter, nobody should be punished for it. No one should suffer death or mutilation in consequence of what's happened. And then he says that the Lady Matilda Longspay, who was the wife of John Gifford, an English marcher baron and one of Llywelyn's cousins, she had begged Peckham to absolve Llywelyn for his sins, but the Archbishop had refused. So the dead prince can't be buried in consecrated ground. And then Edmund Mortimer, most interestingly, he says that he had heard from his valets, his servants who were at the death, that Llywelyn asked for the priest before his death. So Edmund Mortimer wasn't actually personally present when Llywelyn was killed. His servants were, and presumably they were the ones who actually killed Llywelyn. They did the deed. Now, why Edmund would not be present, we've no idea. You would have thought if this was a formal style of execution or assassination in which Llywelyn had been lured into a trap and then deliberately killed, that Edmund would have planned all this or been involved in all of it and would have known exactly what was going to happen, and that he would be present to make sure that the job was done, that Llywelyn was killed, but apparently not. Now there's no explanation for that, and we can come up with all kinds of different scenarios. I mean, perhaps Edmund couldn't bear to look, that he sort of turned away while his servants did the deed, but that's not really very likely. But he says that Edmund's servants told him that Llywelyn asked for a priest before his death so he could confess his sins. And then the same day he was killed, a Cistercian monk, a white monk in white robes, sang mass to him. And my lord Roger Mortimer has the vestments. Roger Mortimer was Edmund's younger brother. So you've got this very peculiar situation in which Llywelyn was apparently killed by Edmund Mortimer's servants, although Edmund wasn't present. He asked for a priest before his death, so clearly they've got him tied up, presumably, somewhere in the woods near Bulth, and he's allowed to speak before they kill him. And then this mysterious white monk, this Cistercian monk, turns up and sings mass to the prince, who is then killed, presumably. And then the fate of the monk is quite mysterious, because Roger Mortimer ends up with his vestments, with his clothes. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Roger killed the monk? I hardly think so, because if he had, Peckham would have been furious. Peckham was always very protective of the church. English monks, Welsh monks. He didn't like the Welsh church. He thought it was corrupt, but he would never have tolerated a priest of any description being murdered by a baron. He would have excommunicated Roger and done all he could to persecute him. So we've no idea who this white monk is or was, but what we do know from this description, and as I said earlier, bear in mind this is private correspondence to the king, so Peckham isn't going to be telling any falsehoods. He's not going to be trying to doctor or mess with the record at all. And the sheer strangeness of the scenario of this account of Llywelyn's death also gives it an air of truth, of veracity, because it is so peculiar. So that's Peckham's letter to Edward. He then, probably on the same day, writes a much longer letter to Robert Burnell, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and the Lord Chancellor, who is also Edward's closest advisor. The two men are always very close. So this again is a very high-level, high-security letter, and Peckham actually supplies Burnell with more detail than he does to the king. But I'll save that letter for another video, I think, because there's a lot to go through here. And these videos can't be too long, really, because just people lose interest and stop watching. But that, I hope, has covered adequately the first letter written by John Peckham, Archbishop of Canterbury, to King Edward himself, within a day or two of the death of Llywelyn, in what sounds like very odd circumstances. And this is, as I've repeatedly pointed out, this is one of the most, because of the nature of the material, probably the most reliable source we've got for Llywelyn's death. So there we are. I hope you all found that interesting, and I'll say more in another video. Thank you.